let's move on. So it works against white's playing first king's pawn move, pawn to e4. Here is pawn with Alekhine Defense, offering white to capture this pawn, and now you play knight f6. You don't want to expose your queen too early, and you prefer to recapture with a knight. In this position, in most cases, they play the move knight to c3, which looks like a meaningful move, but in fact it isn't, because you can capture this pawn on d5 anyway. White does not really defend it. Your knight is protected by the queen, so it is safe to capture the pawn right here. Now, here white usually follows up with yet another error. They capture on d5, which only helps you to activate your queen, to develop your queen, and it stands nicely here on d5. In this position, they usually play either a d4 or a knight f3, which doesn't really matter, because in order to develop their pieces, they need to play both moves anyway. So let's say they go d4 first, you continue with knight to c6, attacking this pawn twice with your queen and knight, therefore they naturally defend it. And here is the position that we're looking for. In this position, you play a paradoxical move knight to b4. At first it looks weird, just some side move with unclear purpose. Also it violates classical opening rules, which tells you to avoid moving the same piece twice in an opening, although that's exactly what you do right here. But strangely enough, in this position, this move is actually pretty powerful. Again, I'm not even sure why, but somehow it works. Now, here's your idea. It's pretty clear. You're gonna play queen e4 check, and that actually delivers a double attack to the king, as well as controls this pawn on c2, and your knight from b4 supports this threat, so it's going to capture the pawn with a fork to the king and rook. Although it may seem like a lot of errors, but in fact, the variations were simple. Also, think about this. If you were playing this position as white, which move would you play, or which moves would you consider overall? That would just help you to realize why this variation is so effective. Because in fact, all of the natural moves of white that they usually play, there's something like, attacking their pieces they play. c3, attacking your knight, or a3, or maybe c4, attacking the queen. But guess what? None of that really interferes with your plans. In fact, they rather push you to move your queen and knight, which you were going to do anyway. So you're kind of provoking white to play moves which you are looking to play. Right? Good things count to those who bait. For example, if white plays pawn to c3, we say, okay, we play queen e4, that's what we were going to do. And our idea is that after white cowers their king however they like it, well, this bishop, with the queen, doesn't matter at all. Let's say with this bishop, in all of those cases we play knight to c2 fork, and that's how we win a free rook on the next move. After the king moves, we just grab the rook. And also, in this variation, it's actually even highly unlikely for white to get this knight back. Like, currently we're already up a rook, and this knight can easily go back, through c2, and then go back, or you can capture this pawn, like, move your queen around and capture the pawn and free up your knight. For example, if they try bishop e3, which is something that they often trying to at least get a knight for a rook, you just move your knight back to c2, and now they usually follow up with bishop d3, thinking that they are now double attacking your pieces, but it's not, because you can take on e3 with check, and that's how you save your knight. That's gonna be check to white's king, or if for some extra trolling, you can capture on e3 with your queen, kind of pretending like you're bonding. But after that, knight takes e3, so that's also a double attack. After white moves, you take over here, and as a result of this, you're having an extra rook at the end. Now, I'm showing these variations just for an example, but in fact, you see that you could win white's rook earlier in this game, just right after that double check. So let me get it back. So after c3, queen e4, and here after bishop e2, knight to c2, basically it is resignable right here. So within something like 8 moves, you win the game, and even strong players fall for this trap because it's really natural for white to do so. Let's go over this plan real quick once again, just to make sure that you are ready for whatever white can throw at you. So after e4, pawn d5, they're attacking the pawn. They have to do something about that. They capture, play knight f6, wanting to regain this pawn on d5. In most cases, they play knight c3, as were discussed in this video. They may also try to hold on to this pawn by playing pawn to c4. Now let's stick to the mainstream move, knight to c3. We take here on d5. They usually recapture, and then they develop one of their pieces, something like knight f3 or a pawn to d4. You respond with knight to c6, they defend it, then you go this we would this weird move knight to b4, and you're threatening queen e4 after basically whatever white plays here. Now let me address also the elephant in the room, because you may be wondering, okay Igor, but what does Stockfish says about this? Well, it says that after a pawn to c3 and queen to e4, the move that saves white is a weird move king to d2, because that's the only way how I can control this c2 square and allow you to jump with your knight there. Of course, for a human being, playing king d2 feels very unnatural, exposing the king, blocking all the other pieces out, and in this case, you have an opportunity to actually achieve a draw with this perpetual check, queen f4 check. Now, since our knight controls these squares, the king has to go back, and with queen e4, he can achieve the repetition. So that's one thing, that, as I've told you earlier, like the worst thing you got here is a draw, but if you want to play on, you can. It's also totally fine. For example, you can play the move pawn to e6, kind of like pretend like you're developing a piece or a boundary this night, and since you've been playing weird moves all along this game, your opponent may think, hey, let me just grab this knight here on b4, and after that, development of your bishop has never been that powerful. Bishop takes b4 actually comes with a checkmate. Finally, in this position, after we played knight to b4, the worst thing white can play is pawn to c4, although it looks really good and aggressive at first, but in reality, it only pushes your queen to go to e4, which was a part of your plan. Now, queen e4 check to the king. Now we're still threatening knight c2 fork to the king and rook. If they want to prevent it, they have to play this weird move king to d2. And now, although you can't play knight c2, but of course white's exposed king in the middle of the board is a great target for you. And you can in fact play bishop f5 and reinforce the threat of knight to c2. Now together with this battery along this diagonal, you are controlling this square twice, and so you may jump with your knight to c2 in the future and attack the rook as well as this pawn on d4 that way. So that's actually a real threat. In this position, white usually goes queen a4, trying to double attack your king and knight, but that doesn't do too much. You can just go back and you're still perfectly fine. They usually play here pawn to d5, hoping that thanks to the spin they can actually win the knight. And also remember that your opponent doesn't know that he's been trapped. He may still think that you're playing some weird opening moves, and he may still wish to punish you and to win, right? But of course, little does he know. In reality, white is already lost here. Now, in this position, many would be tempted to probably just castle, trying to pin the pawn and avoid a loss of the knight. But the one thing that I always recommend to people, always check for attacking moves first, even if you've been attacked. Because normally attacking moves are the most powerful in chess. And here black has an even stronger option, pawn e6, which is a forcing move, or a threatening pawn takes d5, neighbor bishop b4, check to the king that way. And it turns out that if white captures here on c6, it can follow up with casting queenside. And once again, your casting has never been that powerful, it's nearly a checkmate. Check to the king. Now, the king is forced to move right here. And here, once again, you gotta look for forcing moves, which are checks, captures, and attacking moves. But first of all, you gotta look for checks. And here, rook to d3 does the job done. And after a bishop takes and queen takes, that is actually the checkmate. I mean, you may try to memorize these variations, but you can see that it's fairly easy to find them on your own. If you just know the beginning of the trap, and after that, it's just a forcing continuation. By the way,